started this series, a short mini series, a 3-week series that we started a few weeks ago. And the story, the book of Ruth, is this story of redemption and hope. And who doesn't love a story of redemption and hope? But Ruth reminds us that God is able to bring purpose out of pain, and that his presence is constant. His plans are good, even when we don't see them. And when we started this story of Ruth, even though we've said all along, it's a story of joy and redemption, it didn't start at a place of joy and redemption. It started with suffering. And Naomi's family, they fled the country of Israel, moved into Moab. They're searching for food. But while they're there, tragedy strikes, and Naomi's husband dies, and both of her sons pass away, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, in deep grief. And they hear that God's provided food, once again in the nation of Israel. And so after 10 years of being in a foreign land, Naomi goes home to her homeland of Israel. They go to her hometown of Bethlehem. Orpah chooses to stay in her native country of Moab, but Ruth leaves and becomes an immigrant and a widow, and she moves with Ruth in this beautiful display of faithfulness and commitment between 2 people. But when they return different. Naomi changes her name, actually. All the women of the town come out to greet her and say, "This is Naomi, whose name means pleasant." And she says, "Not anymore. Don't call me that. Call me Mara," which means bitter, because she says, "I went out," she says, 4 different times in 4 different ways. "God took me away from here full, and he brought me back empty." But last week we saw a shift take place in the story, right? In chapter 2. In chapter 2, we saw that Ruth was determined to provide for herself and Naomi, and so she takes advantage of what was called gleaning in the fields. This law that God had provided for people who were in poverty to go behind the reapers and the harvesters and to pick up what was left over to provide for their families. And so she goes out and she works, and it's there that she finds the providence of God, God's invisible hand at work. She's guided to the fields of Boaz, a close relative of Naomi. And Boaz showed Ruth incredible kindness. He made sure she was protected and provided for. And we saw last week how the invisible providence of God works together with the tangible compassion of God's people. And today, we're going to experience the rest of the story of Ruth. And we're going to experience it, I think, in a little bit of a different way than normal. We're going to experience it like a movie that's unfolding on a screen with key scenes and dramatic twists and an unexpected ending. This really is a story that's built for the big screen. I don't know about you, but one of our family's favorite pastimes is to actually go to the movies. Anybody else just really enjoy a good movie? 2 of you. That's fantastic. Never mind. We'll move on. The book of Ruth, chapter... I love a good movie, and our family does too. It really, at the age our kids are, it's kind of the thing that we can all agree on, right? That, hey, let's go see a movie. Now, we have difficulty agreeing on the movie, right? But we can at least agree we're going to go to the movies, and everybody enjoys it, and everybody's happy. And it's this just fun experience as we walk into the movie, and as soon as you walk in, it's like the sights and the sounds and the smells all hit you as soon as you walk in the door. And we go through the same rhythm. We usually go straight to the line, and we get in line to order our food, and we kind of always order the same things. It's usually like these little meal packs where you get, of course, a huge thing of popcorn, and then you get your drink, which we usually upsize for a slushie. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. We usually go with a slushie, and then you get your little gummies in there too. So you got your sweet and your salty, everything's going on. Everybody's got their little pack, and we all go to our seats. And now we're really spoiled because most of the time we choose the theater with the bigger seats that recline. Does anybody kind of get an amen on those? It's like, man, thank God for advancements that we've made. Like we've really made it as a culture when we don't have to sit straight up and watch a movie. Like who wants to do that? Let's recline. Let's have heated seats. Let's sit there and watch this movie. And we sit down, we make it through the 20 minutes of advertisements before, and then finally the movie starts. And everybody's just enthralled and enamored with this exciting movie that plays out on the screen with all of the twists and all of the turns and the foreshadowing and surprise ending that no one saw coming, and everybody leaves happy. And the closing of Ruth kind of feels like one of those stories that we see on movies. And today we get to sit back and we get to experience this narrative, this true historical narrative that's been written by the greatest screenwriter of all time, God himself. And he brings us to this moment of redemption that he's been orchestrating from the very beginning of these people's lives. So I would say sit back and grab your popcorn or your slushie, but we don't have that today. That may be next Sunday on Fall Fest, but not for today. But let's enjoy this beautiful story, the road to redemption. And it starts in scene 1. In scene 1, if we could name it something, it would be a glimmer of hope. And we've seen this throughout, by the way, even in the most difficult times, in the middle of suffering and tragedy, there are threads, there are small glimmers of hope where God is still working. God is foreshadowing things to come. And Ruth has been out in the fields all day. She's been gleaning behind the workers. She's experienced the kindness of Boaz, but yet it's still been difficult work to gather this grain and bring it back to her mother-in-law. And she comes home and she walks in the house. Her hands are tired. Her back is sore. She walks through the door and Naomi says, where did you go to glean today? Where did you find work? And Ruth responds and says, well, I worked in the field of this nice man by the name of Boaz. And all of a sudden the music changes and Naomi's eyes light up and you see this glimmer of hope. And in verse 20 of chapter 2, here's what Naomi says. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. So we have an early shift in this story. Naomi, who 4 times earlier said, call me bitter because God's taken everything from me, all of a sudden shifts and says, bless the Lord because he has not forsaken us. You see, here's the thing. Naomi at this point knows something that Ruth, being a foreigner, not a native to Israel, that Ruth does not understand. She knew that Boaz wasn't just just a kind landowner who let Ruth glean in his field. She knew that Boaz is actually what's called a kinsman redeemer. Now, for us to fully understand the weight of this moment, we need to pause and we need to explore this concept of a Jewish kinsman redeemer. You see, in ancient Israel, when tragedy struck a family, whether it's through death or debt or loss, God made a way for that family to be restored. It was called the role of a kinsman redeemer. Leviticus chapter 25, and in verse 25, Leviticus, everybody's favorite book, right? Verse 25 says this, if your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. So this law provided for a person the ability to buy back a relative's land, not just a brother, but the closest relative, to buy back a relative's land and restore it to the family name that could be passed down throughout their lineage. It was a way for God to keep families from falling into generational poverty or having their family name just completely blotted out of history. And so this kinsman redeemer is created by God. Now, the redeemer had 3 qualifications. In order for someone to be a kinsman redeemer, they had to meet 3 qualifications. Number 1, they had to be a relative. And the closest relative would have the first option or the right of refusal to redeem. So they had to be a relative. Number two, they had to have the resources to redeem, which meant basically they had to have the ability to actually pay the price for the land. They had to have the resources. And then number three, they had to have the resolve to actually follow through with it. And by resolve, I mean they could have the ability to do it and still not want to do it. Because sometimes it wasn't a good financial investment to redeem your relative's land. Because sometimes there were so many strings attached. Sometimes that relative's family came with it. The person would actually marry the dead relative's wife and raise children, not in his name, but in his relative's name. And so this person would be taken on the responsibility of not only caring for this land, but also caring this for this family. And he truly wouldn't even get credit for it, because the credit for the land and the credit for the family would go to the dead relative, which would continue to be passed down throughout history. Does that make sense? Very different than the way our life works today, right? But how it worked in this day and time. And so Naomi, understanding this, sees a glimmer of hope in the story. And she's thinking to herself, Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. Boaz is our glimmer of hope, a tangible compassion of God. And then scene one ends. And we find ourselves in scene two, which we could call a new chapter. And in scene two, the harvest has been completed. So several weeks have passed at this point. The harvest is completed. All of the landowners and the laborers are coming together for a typical celebration on the threshing floor. And I think we actually have a picture of what a Jewish threshing floor at this time would look like, right? Can you guys throw that up on the screen? I remember when I was a kid, I imagined a threshing floor, and it looked more like a dance floor in my mind for some reason, but nothing like that. But this was the threshing floor where they would actually bring the wheat or the barley, and they would thresh it, okay? Which basically meant they would trample it to separate the wheat or the grain from the chaff. So they're separating what you can eat from what you can't eat. And so everyone's gathering here. They've done all the work, and now it's a party. In verse 1 of chapter 3, here's what it says. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing the barley tonight at the threshing floor. So wash and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place that he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. This passage takes a little bit of explaining, okay? When you read this with a Western mindset, it sounds like Naomi is coercing her daughter into luring an older man into a romantic relationship. Our modern technical word would be sugar daddy. But some of you are like, did he say that? Yes, that's what it is. And that's the way our Western mind goes. It seems like that she's saying, put on your makeup, your best perfume, and your most flattering dress, and go down to the celebration and seduce him. But we've watched way too many movies, and we have to take off our Hollywood lens, and we have to see it through a Hebrew worldview in 1200 BC. Here's what's taking place. In the ancient world, widows wore clothing signifying that they were widows, signifying that they were in mourning. It was a visible sign saying, I am grieving, but it also meant, leave me alone, I'm not looking for a date. Ruth had been wearing these clothes since her husband had passed. And here, Naomi instructs her, Ruth, I want you to wash yourself, anoint yourself, and take off the clothes of mourning. Take off the clothes that a widow would wear. And I want you to make a shift. And I want you to dress in new clothes. She's saying to Ruth, your days of mourning are over. It's time to turn the page. And so while there is a romantic story that's taking place, there's not a story of seduction. It's a story of a widow who's turning the page on her grief and beginning to look to the future. This is a mother-in-law who's helping her widow daughter-in-law look or to begin to understand that God has been present with her in her grief, but now he's leading her to a new chapter. She's helping her realize that the providence of God not only works for Israelites, but it also works for widowed foreigners, for Moabites as well, and that he is not done with her yet, but he has hope and redemption for her future. I think there's so many applications that we can make here. There's too many to make for sake of time, and I'm going to trust the Holy Spirit to take and apply it to your heart and to your story and to your mind. But there is one that I want to share, and that's this, that every single one of us will go through chapters of grief in our life. Times when we experience loss, the loss of a family member, the loss of a friend, the loss of a relationship, the loss of financial security, the loss of a dream. And anytime we experience loss, those are seasons of grief in our life. And in those seasons of grief, here's what I've found personally, but also I've experienced and seen through other people. When you go through a season of grief, that grief can be so overwhelming and so numbing to your heart and soul that it's hard for you to imagine a new and better chapter. When you're living in a chapter of grief, it's hard to know that there are other chapters in the book that God has for you, and that one day the grief's going to subside and fade, and that God's going to bring joy and life and laughter and hope to your story again. And if you've been in a season of grief, you know how overwhelming that is. But like Ruth, sometimes we need to understand that God, even in our grief, and we're just moving forward, trying to get through day after day and trying to survive, that God sees us, that God has a plan for us. And we need to know that seasons of grief do pass. And with time and in community and with the hand of God, we're led into new chapters. I love Psalm 30 that I think echoes this well. In verse 4, it says this, "Sing praises to the Lord, O you, his saints, and give thanks to his holy name, for his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning." It's a season, it's a chapter, and God moves us to new chapters throughout our lives. So scene 2 closes, scene 3 opens up, and scene 3 we'll call Ruth's bold move. Now we arrive at one of the most dramatic moments in the story. Ruth follows Naomi's instructions. She goes to the threshing floor. She waits for Boaz to finish his work and then lie down for the night. And after he falls asleep, she does what she says, and she uncovers his feet and she lies down. And in the middle of the night, Boaz is startled awake. In verse 9 it says, "And he said this, 'Who are you?'" Seems like a very good question, right? You're sleeping out in the middle of a field and all of a sudden someone uncovers your feet and lies down at your feet. Okay, what's going on here? Who are you? And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Now again, we're going to move out of our Western American lens, and we need to translate this, okay? So we've got to look at this through another lens. This is an Old Testament marriage proposal. It looks a little different. No down on one knee, no ring, no "will you marry me?" Just Ruth uncovering Boaz's feet and saying, "Spread your wings over me." I don't recommend that pickup line here in 2024. So I don't know if some of you guys are thinking about using it. You know, it just doesn't come across the same way. You know, hey, spread your wings over me. Like, it just is not going to work, all right? Don't use that. Sounds like a terrible pickup line that someone would have used when I was, studying to be a pastor in Bible college. Like, it just does not work in any situation today. It worked then. This is Ruth asking Boaz to perform the role of the kinsman redeemer. She's asking him to voluntarily purchase back the land that belonged to Elimelech, Naomi's husband, which also, as part of this whole deal and this whole package, would involve him marrying Ruth. So it's a proposal to marry Ruth and take on all of this responsibility, to pay the price, to buy the land back, to purchase the family name back ultimately, and then to provide for them, and also marry a foreigner. It's a huge, bold move that takes place on the threshing floor that night. And again, I want to just kind of make sure we pointed it out last week, but there's this rhythm in this story that we see again and again. And it's this divine dance that's happening where God takes a miraculous step of provision towards them, and Ruth and Naomi take a step of faith. God provides food in Bethlehem. Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem, and Ruth gleans in the field. God leads her miraculously to the field of Boaz, but Ruth steps out in faith and asks Boaz to be her kinsman redeemer. And this is how God worked in their story, and this is how God works in our story. And I think it's so important that we see that and we understand that, because sometimes I think we can find ourselves just sitting still and saying, okay, God, I'm just waiting for you to move. And the reality is sometimes God has already moved, and he's invited us to take a next step. And the issue is not that God hasn't shown us what step to take, but the issue is it's a step that we're scared to take. And it's a step that will require us to take a step of faith, a step of obedience. And so sometimes we find ourselves sitting at a crossroads and we're saying, God, I need you to lead me. And God's going, I've already led you. Now it's your turn to take that next step. And so I just want you to begin to ask yourself, is there a step that God's brought you to that you've just refused to continue to move forward? Is there an obvious step of obedience that God has said, this is what I'm asking you to do next? And you've just said, no. Because the truth is God works through his providence, but also through our initiative. So how does Boaz respond to this request? Well, he is obviously flattered by the way that Ruth has asked him to spread his wings over her. And he responds by saying, Ruth, you've done so much kindness to me in this request. And he says, you've chosen me over all the young men that you could have had. And he's flattered by this. And so he agrees to do what she's asked. Ultimately, he says yes. And so you see the story as we're watching it unfold on a movie, and this is the scene where love is in the air and everyone is just crying because all of a sudden you realize, I knew they were perfect for each other, and now it's like it's happening. They're going to get together. And then the music stops. And Boaz says this in verse 12. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet, don't you hate that word? Yet or but. There is a redeemer that's nearer than I. At this point, the audience would just gasp. Someone would yell out, oh no, because everybody wants Boaz and Ruth to get together. It's a beautiful story. And he's like, yeah, I want to, but I am a redeemer, but I'm second in line. I'm not first. And there's a relative that's closer than I am, and he'll have first dibs. And all of a sudden, everybody's mind is like, yeah, but who is he? We like Boaz. We know him. He's a nice guy. He loves her. He'll provide for her. Well, this other guy's a terrible person, and he'll just take advantage of her, and he'll steal the land and all this kind of stuff. It begins to go through our minds. And that leads us then to the fourth and final scene, which we'll call a deal at the gate. And in the fourth and final scene, it moves from this intimate setting of the threshing floor to the public arena at the city gate, and it's the following day. And the gates of the city would have been more like a modern day city hall. It's where all the legal transactions and the business took place. And Boaz doesn't waste any time. He goes straight to the gate. He gathers all of the elders of the city together, and he approaches the other kinsman redeemer, the one who is first in line to redeem Naomi's land. And it's interesting here, this little tidbit in the story, that when the author describes this other man, it gives him a name that literally means so-and-so. And it's this idea that the author is intentionally saying that this guy's name doesn't even really matter because he's not going to play a major role in the story. So it just calls him Mr. So-and-so. And so Mr. So-and-so comes and Boaz brings him before the elders. And at first, when he mentions the opportunity to redeem, Mr. So-and-so is excited at the idea and says, yeah, I'd love to do this. And then Boaz mentions, and oh, by the way, if you take the land, also you have to take Naomi, the widow, and you have to provide for her, and you have to take her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the Moabite, and you have to marry her, you have to raise children in honor of her dead husband's name. And all of a sudden, the guy's like, wait a second. This does not sound like the deal that I wanted to sign up for. And he makes up this excuse and says, I can't do it. And all of a sudden, everybody watching realizes, hey, we're going to get the ending that we want. And of course, Boaz steps forward and he's willing to seal the deal. And they do this thing again, which makes no sense of us. They take off their shoes and they swap shoes with each other, which was ultimately them signing it into writing. And everybody witnessed it. And so Boaz, in the end, gets the girl, or the girl gets the guy, ever how you want to say it. And so Boaz, in verse 13, here's the conclusion, the finale of the story. In verse 13, it says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went in unto her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. So, if you love a good love story, danger averted, they get married, wedding bells are ringing, and the scene changes at this point. The scene changes and it shifts away from this story that has focused for so long on Ruth and Boaz, and now it's focused on their love and how they're coming together in this beautiful marriage, and it's shifting. And the story shifts to a scene after the wedding, and a baby boy is born by the name of Obed, which means God's servant. And we think to ourselves, what better way to end a movie and to bring this back full circle, to have the people, the love interests, get married, and here they are. It's a beautiful story, this ending where they're in love and they have a son. And then the camera, it pans away and it looks at Naomi, this widowed grandmother, for this full circle moment that brings complete closure to the story. Naomi, who had endured so much loss and so much suffering, that she told the women, call me bitter. She's now in this closing scene, she's surrounded by the same women. And notice what they say about her in verse 14. It says, and then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without. And I want to pause there. We're going to come back and read the rest of the verse. But I want to pause there because this is a throwback to the beginning of the story. This is a throwback to chapter 1. If you were here in chapter 1, do you remember what it said when her husband died? It says, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. And then when her sons died, it says, and Naomi was left without anyone to provide for her. And the whole point, the focus the author was trying to get us to see by mentioning left with and left without is that Naomi has been abandoned. And grief has left her with, and grief has left her without. But now in this full circle moment, it comes back around. And what does the author say? What do the women say? Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without. She's felt like she's been completely abandoned. But here in this beautiful play on words, this closing scene, the women boldly announce that she has not been left by the Lord. And he says, they say you have not been left without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. And Naomi's road to redemption is now complete. But the question for us is, what do we take from this story? What do we take from this movie? And I think the easy path to take that some of us want to run to is that God always gives a fairy tale ending. That's it. Follow God and love him, and he makes all of your dreams come true. But that can't be it, because that does not happen for everyone. It didn't happen for Paul at the end of his life. It didn't happen for John the Baptist, and it didn't happen to so many people who loved and followed Jesus. It didn't happen for Naomi's husband. It didn't happen for Ruth's husband. They didn't get their happy ending. So that can't be it. So what is God really saying to us? And I believe it's this. The real lesson is that God is present. And he's faithful. And in every aspect of our story and Ruth's story, he is present and he is faithful. He was there for Naomi. He was there in the suffering. He was there in the glimmers of hope. He was there in Ruth's kindness. He was there in the invisible providence that just so happened in the field. He was there in the kindness of Boaz. He was there in the kinsman redeemer. He was there all along. And he was working to bend her suffering towards his goodness. And now this is the moment where, if we're watching this as a movie, it all comes together for us. And we begin to look around and say, that was pretty good, right? The credits start to roll. We get up out of our seats. We gather our trash. And we start to go home. But have you ever been to a movie, especially like the Marvel ones, where somebody's like, hey, don't leave. I remember my first Marvel movie. I had no clue. I'm like walking out and somebody's like, where are you going? It's not done yet. There's more. Because if you know the Marvel scenes, there's always a post scene, right? Where they're going to tell you something about what's coming up. And there's a post-credit scene that takes place here. I want you to see it quickly in verse 17. It says, and when the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, they named him Obed. And they said he was the father of Jesse and the father of David. Here's how this story ends. There's a post-credit scene, and what we're getting a glimpse of something bigger than Ruth and Boaz and their little love story. The screenwriter wants you to know that this story, their story, is really a part of a bigger story. Their son Obed is going to grow up to be the father of a man named Jesse. And Jesse's going to be the father of a king by the name of David, the greatest king that Israel would ever know. And so we read that and go, wow, that's awesome. But the author is saying, I want you to know even more than that. And if you were to push past that lineage, and you make it all the way to the book of Matthew, you know, chapter 1, where it's like, and so begat so-and-so, and so begat so-and-so. It's the thing all of you skip over. You know what I'm talking about? And you're like, nothing in here. And the author is leaving it like a little cliffhanger. Like, hey, Obed became the grandfather of the greatest king that Israel's ever seen, King David. And God brought all of that through this story of suffering and tragedy. And he brought King David, he brought him through the seed of a woman who wasn't even a native Israelite. And somehow he wove that all in the story. But if you go all the way to Matthew, you find another lineage. And guess whose lineage that is? It's the lineage of Jesus Christ. And what the author in Matthew is doing is he's linking Jesus all the way back to David and ultimately all the way up to Obed and all the way up to Ruth and Boaz. And there's a little foreshadowing that's going on here at the end of the movie that's saying this story is not the end. It's just the beginning. And it's not just about the redemption of a small family here in Israel in 1200 BC, but it's about a God who's writing a bigger story. It's about the redemption of the entire world because another kinsman redeemer is coming. A kinsman redeemer is coming. His name is Jesus. And he has all the resources to pay the price for our sins, to redeem us back. And he has the resolve to do it. And one day he's going to go to a cross and he's going to die on that cross and resurrect from that grave. And he's going to be the redeemer, not just one family needs, but the redeemer that the entire world needs. Now that's a post scene, amen? And every single one of us benefit from that. And every single one of us can recognize that Jesus Christ, listen, he's been working for your redemption long before you were ever thought of. Some 2,000 years ago, 3,200 years ago, he was working with you in mind. And all of this story is being woven together by the master screenwriter of the universe, God himself. And you and I have been invited into that story. A story not just of redemption of our personal story on this life, but the redemption of our soul and the redemption of this world that will take place in eternity.